Happy Halloween, friends. It's Mr. Lures, and this will be our last day reading aloud through the Scary Stories Treasury book. We didn't read every single story through here, so if you go to a local library, you order this, you might be able to read some stories that we didn't talk about during this read aloud over the last 2 weeks. However, let's try to get through as many as we can here in our last session. Our first spooky story today is called The Wolf Girl. Travel northwest into the desert from Del Rio, Texas, and eventually you will come to the Devil's River. In the 1930s, a trapper named John Dent and his wife Molly settled where Dry Creek runs into Devil's River. Dent was after beaver, which were plentiful there. He and Molly built a cabin from brush, and near it they put up an arbor to give them shade. Molly Dent became pregnant. When she was ready to have their child, John Dent raced on horseback to their nearest neighbors several miles away. "My wife is having a baby," he said to the man and his wife. "Can you help us?" They agreed to come at once. As they got ready to leave, a violent storm came up and a bolt of lightning struck and killed John Dent. The man and his wife managed to find his cabin, but did not arrive until the next day. By then, Molly Dent was dead too. It looked as if she had given birth before she died, but the neighbors could not find the baby. Since there were wolf tracks all around, they decided the wolves had eaten it. They buried Molly Dent and left. A number of years after she died, people began to tell a strange tale. Some swore it was a true story. Others said it could never have happened. The story begins in a small settlement a dozen miles from Molly Dent's grave. Early one morning, a pack of wolves raced in from the desert and killed some goats. Such attacks were not unusual in those days. But a boy thought he saw a naked young girl with long blonde hair running with the wolves. A year or two later, a woman came upon some wolves eating a goat that they had just killed. Eating the goat with them, she claimed, was a naked young girl with long blonde hair. When the wolves and the girl saw her, they fled. The woman said that at first the girl ran on all fours. Then she stood and ran like a human, swiftly as the wolves. People started wondering if this wolf girl was Molly Dent's daughter. Had a mother wolf carried her off one day when she was born and raised her with her pups? If so, by now she would be 10 or 11 years old. As the story is told, some men began to look for the girl. They searched along the riverbanks and in the desert and its canyons. And one day, it is said, they found her, walking in a canyon along with a wolf at her side. When the wolf ran off, the girl hid in an opening in one of the canyon walls. When the men tried to capture her, she fought back, fighting and scratching like an enraged animal. When they finally subdued her, she began screaming like a frightened young girl and howling like a frightened young wolf. Her captors bound her with rope, put her across a horse, and took her to a small ranch house in the desert. They would turn her over to the sheriff the next day. They decided. They placed her in an empty room and untied her. Terror-stricken, she hid in the shadows. They left her and locked the door. Soon she was screaming and howling again. The men thought they would go mad listening to her, but at last she stopped. When night fell, wolves began howling in the distance. People say that each time they stopped, the girl howled in reply. As the story goes, the cries of wolves came from every direction and got closer and closer. Suddenly, as if a signal had been given, wolves attacked the horses and other livestock. The men rushed into the darkness, firing their guns. High up in the wall, in the room where they had left the girl, was a small window. A plank was nailed across it. She pulled the plank off, crawled through the window, and disappeared. Years passed with no word of the girl. Then one day, some men on horseback came around a bend in the Rio Grande, not far from the Devil's River. They claimed they saw a young woman with long blonde hair feeding 2 wolf pups. When she saw the men, she snatched up the pups and ran into the brush. They rode after her, but she quickly left them behind. They searched and searched, but found no trace of her. That is the last we know of the wolf girl. And it is there, in the desert, near the Rio Grande, that this story ends. The next spooky story is The Dream. Lucy Morgan was an artist. She had spent a week painting in a small country town and decided that the next day she would move on. She would go to a village called Kingston, But that night, Lucy Morgan had a strange dream. She dreamed that she was walking up a dark, carved staircase and entered a bedroom. It was an ordinary room except for two things. The carpet was made up of large squares that looked like trapdoors, and each of the windows was fashioned shut with big nails that stuck up out of the wood. In her dream, Lucy Morgan went to sleep in that bedroom. During the night, a woman with a pale face and black eyes and a long black hair came into the room. She leaned over the bed and whispered, "This is an evil place. Flee while you can." When the woman touched her arm to hurry her along, Lucy Morgan awakened from her dream with a shriek. She lay awake the rest of the night, trembling. In the morning, she told her landlady that she had decided not to go to Kingston after all. "I can't tell you why," she said, "but I can't bring myself to go there." "Then why don't you go to Dorset?" the landlady said. "It's a pretty town, and it isn't too far." So Lucy Morgan went to Dorset. Someone told her she could find a room in a house at the top of the hill. It was a pleasant-looking house, and the landlady there, a plump, motherly woman, was as nice as could be. "Let's look at the room," she said. "I think you will like it." They walked up a dark, carved staircase, like the one in Lucy's dream. In these old houses, the staircases are all the same, Lucy thought. But when the landlady opened the door to the bedroom, it was the room in her dream, with the same carpet that looked like trapdoors and the same windows fastened with big nails. "This is just a coincidence," Lucy told herself. "How do you like it?" the landlady asked. "I'm not sure," she said. "Well, take your time," the landlady said. "I'll bring up some tea while you think about it." Lucy sat on the bed staring at the trapdoors and the big nails. Soon there was a knock on the door. "It's the landlady with the tea," she thought. But it wasn't the landlady. It was the woman with the pale face and the black eyes and the long black hair. Lucy Morgan grabbed her things and fled. This next spooky story is called Maybe You Will Remember. Mrs. Gibbs and her 16-year-old daughter, Rosemary, arrived in Paris on a hot morning in July. They had been on a vacation and now were returning home. But Mrs. Gibbs did not feel well, so they decided to rest in Paris for a few days before going on. The city was crowded with tourists. Still, they found a good place to stay at a good hotel. They had a lovely room overlooking a park. It had yellow walls, a blue carpet, and white furniture. As soon as they unpacked, Mrs. Gibbs went to bed. She looked so pale that Rosemary asked to have the hotel's doctor examine her. Rosemary did not speak French, but fortunately, the doctor spoke English. He took one look at Mrs. Gibbs and said, "Your mother is too sick to travel. Tomorrow I will move her to a hospital, but she needs a certain medicine. If you go to my house for it, it will save time." The doctor said he did not have a telephone right now, and said he would give Rosemary a note for his wife. The hotel manager put Rosemary in a taxi and in French told the driver how to find the doctor's house. "It will only take a little while," he told her, "and the taxi will bring you back." But as the driver slowly drove up one street and down another, it seemed to take forever. At one point, Rosemary was sure they had gone down the same street twice. It took almost as long for the doctor's wife to answer the door, then get the medicine ready. As Rosemary sat on a bench in the empty waiting room, she kept thinking, "Why can't you hurry? Please hurry." Then she heard a telephone ring somewhere in the house. But the doctor had told her he didn't have a telephone right now. What was going on? They drove back as slowly as they had come, crawling up one street and down another. Rosemary sat in the back seat filled with dread, her mother's medicine clutched in her hand. Why was everything taking so long? She was sure the taxi driver was going in the wrong direction. Are you going in the to the right hotel?" she asked. He didn't answer. She asked again, but he still didn't reply. When he stopped for a traffic light, she threw open the door and ran from the cab. She stopped the woman on the street. The woman did not speak English, but she knew someone who did. Rosemary was right. They had been driving in the wrong direction. When she finally got back to the hotel, it was nearly evening. She went up to the desk clerk who had given them their room. "I'm Rosemary Gibbs," she said. "My mother and I are in room 505. May I please have the key?" The clerk looked at her closely. You must be mistaken, he said. There's another guest in that room. Are you sure you are in the right hotel? He turned to help someone else. She waited until he was finished. You gave us that room yourself when we arrived this morning, she said. How could you forget? He stared at her as if she had lost her mind. You must be mistaken, he said. I have never seen you before. Are you sure you're in the right hotel? She asked to see the registration card they had filled out when they arrived. It's June and Rosemary Gibbs, she said. The clerk looked in his file. We have no card for you, he said. You must be at the wrong hotel. The hotel doctor will know me, Rosemary replied. He examined my mother when we arrived. He sent me for medicine she needs. I want to see him. The doctor came downstairs. Here's the medicine for my mother, Rosemary said, holding it out to him. Your wife gave it to me. I have never seen you before, he said. You must be in the wrong hotel. She asked for the hotel manager who had put her in the taxi. Surely he would remember her. You must be in the wrong hotel, he said. Let me give you a room where you can rest. Then maybe you'll remember where you and your mother are staying. I want to see our room, Rosemary said, raising her voice. It's room 505. But it was nothing like the room she remembered. It had a double bed, not twin beds. The furniture was black, not white. The carpet was green, not blue. There was someone else's clothing in the closet. The room she knew had vanished, and so had her mother. This is not the room, she said. Where is my mother? What have you done with her? You are in the wrong hotel, the manager said patiently, as if he was speaking to a young child. Rosemary asked to see the police. My mother, our things, the room, they have all disappeared, she told them. Are you sure you're in the right hotel, they asked. She went to her embassy for help. Are you sure it's the right hotel, they asked. Rosemary thought she was losing her mind. Why don't you rest here for a while, they said. Then maybe you'll remember. But Rosemary's problem was not her memory. It was what she did not know. And do you know or think you know what happened to Rosemary's mother? This is how the story ends at the end of the book. When the hotel doctor saw Mrs. Gibbs, he knew at once that she was about to die. She had a form of the plague, a dread disease that killed quickly and caused frightening epidemics. If word got out that a woman had died of the plague in the heart of Paris, there would be panic. People in the hotel and everywhere would rush to escape. The doctor knew what the hotel's owners expected. He was to keep the case a secret. Otherwise, they would lose lots of money. To get Rosemary out of the way, the doctor sent her to the other side of Paris for some worthless medicine. As he expected, Mrs. Gibbs died soon after she left. Her body was smuggled out of the hotel to a cemetery where it was buried. A team of workmen quickly repainted the room and replaced everything in it. The desk clerks were ordered to tell Rosemary that she was in the wrong hotel. When she insisted on seeing the room, it had been a different place, and of course her mother had vanished. All of those involved were warned that they would lose their jobs if they gave away the secret. To avoid panic in the city, the police and the newspapers agreed to say nothing of the truth. No police reports were filed, no news stories appeared. It was as if Rosemary's mother and her room had never existed. This story is called The Red Spot. While Ruth slept, a spider crawled across her face. It stopped for several minutes on her left cheek, then went on its way. What is that red spot on my cheek? She asked her mother the next morning. It looks like a spider bite, her mother said. It'll go away. Just don't scratch it. Soon the small spot grew into a small red boil. Look at it now, Ruth said. It's getting bigger. It's sore. That happens sometimes, her mother said. It's coming to a head. In a few days, the boil was even larger. Look at it now, Ruth said. It hurts, and it's ugly. We'll have the doctor look at it, her mother said. Maybe it's infected. But the doctor could not tell Ruth until the next day. That night, Ruth took a hot bath. As she soaked herself, the boil burst. Out poured a swarm of spiders from the eggs their mother had laid in her cheek. There's a picture of that. This next spooky story is titled Strangers. A man and a woman happened to sit next to one another on a train. The woman took out a book and began reading. The train stopped at a half a dozen stations, but she never looked up once. The man watched her for a while, then asked, "What are you reading?" "It's a ghost story," she said. "It's very good, very spooky." "Do you believe in ghosts?" he asks. "Yes, I do," she replied. "There are ghosts everywhere." "I don't believe in them," he said. "It's just a lot of superstition. In all my years, I've never seen a ghost. Not one." "Haven't you?" the woman said, and vanished. There's a picture of that. And the last story we're going to read out of this book is called It's Him. The woman was the meanest, most miserable person you could imagine, and her husband was just as bad. The only good thing was that they lived in the woods all by themselves and couldn't bother anybody else. One day they were off somewhere getting firewood, and the woman got so mad at her husband that she grabbed an axe and cut his head off just like that. Then she buried him nice and neat and went home. She made herself a cup of soup and tea and went out on the porch. She sat there rocking in her rocking chair, sipping her tea, thinking how glad she was that she had done this awful thing. After a while, she heard this old empty voice out in the distance, moaning and groaning, and it was saying, "Who's going to stay with me this cold and lonely night? Who?" "It's him," she thought, and hollered back, "Stay by yourself, you old goat." Soon she heard the voice again, only now it was closer, and it was saying, "Who's going to sit with me on this cold and lonely night? Ooh." "Only a crazy man," she shouted. "Sit by yourself, you dirty rat." Then she heard the voice get even closer, and it was saying, "Who is going to be with me on this cold and lonely night? Ooh." "Nobody," she sneered. "Be by yourself, you miserable mole." She stood up to go into the house, but now the voice was right behind her, and it was whispering, "Who is going to stay with me on this cold and lonely night? Ooh." Before she could answer back, a big hairy hand came around the corner and grabbed her, and the voice hollered, "You are! Ha ha ha!" Did I get you this final time? Maybe I did, maybe I didn't. But friends, that is our last spooky story for this book. Like I said, the Spooky Stories Treasury is actually 3 books: Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark, More Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark, and Scary Stories 3, More Chills to Chill Your Bones. While I read a majority of these books and spooky stories, there were a couple that were skipped because of time. So if you want to go and see which ones we missed, feel free to go pick up the Spooky Story Treasury book, or go check out one of these 3 other books and enjoy the spooky stories on your own. As for me, I'm Mr. Lures. I hope you enjoyed the spooky stories during this spooky season, and we'll see you for the next read aloud. Have a good day, friends.